If we could take our seats, we're going to begin our program. And I am pleased to welcome our trustees, our distinguished guests, our colleagues, faculty, staff, students, and friends. This afternoon, we inaugurate a new annual tradition. It can't be an annual tradition unless you've done it twice, right? But anyway, this is the first. Namely, a spring Eugene H. Fram lecture to complement our fall lecture by the same name. Now, many of you attended that lecture last September. In fact, a number of you have been present at all of them. You would thereby know that today's special guest is Professor Richard Arum of New York University, and he's no stranger to this stage. We are fortunate that he has agreed to return to RIT, especially given his demanding travel schedule and other commitments. And you will see he's been a busy man since the last time he was here. Today, he will present the findings from his latest book, Aspiring Adults Adrift, that's like me, an important follow-up to his landmark study from 2011, Academically Adrift, which sent shockwaves throughout much of the educational establishment. It sparked a healthy and important debate about the core mission of higher education, with its call for a renewed emphasis on writing, complex reasoning, and critical thinking, such essential lifelong skills. And I might add, the related dispositional attitudes that go with them is precisely the reason why RIT established the Eugene H. Fram Chair in Applied Critical Thinking, with the support from an anonymous RIT alumnus in honor of his former teacher, mentor, and friend, Gene Fram. And Gene himself is the J. Warren McClure Professor Emeritus of Marketing at the Saunders College of Business. By the way, that was all strung into one sentence, but I changed it. Gene served on our faculty for an amazing 51 years. And we are so grateful to him for his example. Gene has traveled all the way from sunny Northern California to sunny Rochester to be with us today. So, Gene, please stand and be recognized. Where are you? Here. Now, critical thinking remains a key competency that all employers demand from our graduates, in fact, increasingly so. Critical thinking is also necessary and vital for a truly democratic society to exist and to flourish, in my opinion. In fact, I think we are at an age where the value of a college education as training for productive citizenship is under attack, and we need to defend that at all costs. Ultimately, we desire for our students to become actively engaged global citizens. In a deeper and more profound sense, critical thinking can help them to understand themselves, the world, and their place within it. RIT aims to take the lead in this area, to become a model for other institutions, and to work tirelessly to make this a priority here. I'm pleased to note that critical thinking is a central theme of our new strategic plan, as you know, titled Greatness Through Difference, and that it is a key learning outcome in our revised general education framework. Today also marks the end of the initial 3-year term held by Professor Clarence B. Sheffield, Jr., the inaugural recipient of the Fram Chair, who is stepping down and who will return to the classroom. I don't think he ever actually left the classroom, to tell you the truth. He will hand over the reins to a very capable successor who we will anticipate naming very soon. I guess if I told you, I'd have to kill you or something like that. Chip has worked very hard to establish the necessary foundation, to set up the proper course, and to make critical thinking a significant part of our campus culture. He also acknowledges that there is much work left to be done. Please join me in thanking Chip for his efforts, as well as welcoming him to the podium to introduce Professor Arum.
Thanks very much, President Dessler. It's a beautiful day. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. It's just really fantastic to see so many faces, friendly faces, and so many friends. Over the last decade, Richard Arum has achieved special prominence in the vast and exceedingly complex landscape called American higher education. He is a professor, as President Dessler noted, in the Department of Sociology, with a joint appointment at the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU. This fall, he will begin a 3-year term as the NYU Sociology Department Chair. Richard is widely recognized as one of our nation's foremost sociologists of education. If our colleges and universities are indeed in a state of crisis, increasingly under threat from a variety of forces, then there is no one better suited to explain the myriad factors that have led to this situation, its broader social implications, as well as a possible road map forward. That is a workable solution to the problem than Richard Arum. He truly has his finger on the pulse of education, not simply in the United States, but in a global perspective. This is one of the reasons why he was asked to serve as a senior fellow at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. Richard earned his BA in political science from Tufts University, magna cum laude, his M.Ed in teaching and curriculum from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, and his PhD in sociology at University of California, Berkeley. Academically adrift, which has been referred to, his landmark 2011 study, co-authored with his former student, Josipa Roksa, argued that the students, and to a certain limited extent, the faculty, were to blame for the decline in academic rigor. His latest book, their latest book, Aspiring Adults Adrift, makes a significant pivot or a shift. It argues that many of our colleges and universities share equal responsibility for this problem. Far too many have adopted a therapeutic ethic, a concierge, country club mentality, regarding their students, as well as their parents, as consumers, to be satisfied at all cost. Social engagement and sociality, the demand for amenities, and other expensive services has taken priority in many instances over our core academic mission, namely, to promote robust student learning and academic rigor. If the students contemplated Plato while floating down the campus's lazy river, then Arum and Roksa's argument would not be as sobering. Sadly, this is not always the case. Their findings show that recent graduates possess a false sense of optimism and hope, a sense of entitlement, as well as a belief in their own exceptionalism that borders, I think, in times on the delusional. Professor Arum is not, however, a cynic or a pessimist. There is a strong pragmatic, and I might even add, idealist subtext to his argument. He cares deeply about education. He cares deeply about our students, about our faculty, and I think about our administration as well. And even broader, our society. And he wants nothing more than for all of them to be better served. He acknowledges that reversing the course will take hard work, time, courage, and determination. Now, unfortunately, Daniel F. Chambliss, the Eugene M. Tobin Distinguished Professor at Hamilton College, who had accepted very warmly and graciously my invitation to serve as today's respondent, is unable to be here today. I think it's a real mark of what kind of man Richard Arum is, that when I informed him of this, he said, I am glad to give Dan co-billing, co-time, co-stage. I admire him and respect him so immensely. The reason Dan Chambliss is unable to be here is he suffered a mild heart attack late Tuesday afternoon, and he's recovering at the hospital. His prognosis is very good, and he really does deeply regret his absence. I'd encourage you to read his book, How College Works. It's very, very interesting and very worthwhile. I'm immensely grateful to Dr. James Hall, the new director of the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies, who's agreed to step in, to pitch hit as our respondent today. It was Jim who first recommended Chambliss's book to me, and maybe he will regret that now, this past fall. And I'm very, very grateful to Jim for this reading tip and certainly many other excellent reading tips. In his brief 6 months that he's been here at RIT, Jim has already made a profound impact on our campus. I very much look forward to working with him in the months to come, and I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to be our respondent on such short notice. Richard, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back.
Thank you very much, Chip. Very gracious as always. And thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day. Anxious and excited to be sharing with you this follow-up, this sequel, if you will, to the work I shared with you here 2 years ago. So let me start with a one-page review. This is some of your best or worst professors do in class. This is a review of the my last time here, the Cliff Notes version of Academically Adrift. And it turns out the Cliff Notes version is very useful because one of the findings I'll share with you on the lack of academic rigor is that a third of students say that they don't have a single class where they read more than 40 pages on an average week. And so Academically Adrift has 150 pages. It would take a month. And so now you have the Cliff Notes version. We'll share these PowerPoints maybe after, and you can just give them the one-page version. And the one-page version goes something like this. There's three kind of core arguments there, core sets of findings. The first on limited academic rigor. And that is if you actually go and ask students in a typical four-year institution, not all of them, but many of them, too many, will say they're exposed to very limited academic rigor. And some of the findings I shared with you, the average, the number of students that'll say they don't have a single class with more than 40 pages of reading per week, but also half the students will tell you they don't have a single class with more than 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester. Not a single class. That's not a 20-page paper, mind you, but all their writing put together, not a single class, half of the students. And if you ask them about hours studying, a little more than a third will say, we study alone less than 5 hours per week, less than an hour a day. And their grade point average is a 3.22. We had their transcripts. You don't need to study more than an hour a day in order to do well, particularly if you're in that group that's taking courses with little writing and little reading. That's the first piece of set of findings. The second would be limited learning. And of course, there's limited learning once you start off with the lack of academic rigor. Our pedagogy might be good and improving, but it would really have to be exceptional to overcome this lack of academic rigor. And in fact, what you see is large numbers of students moving up very little on a measure we give of their generic performance, their generic competencies in higher education. I'll tell you a little bit more about this measure shortly. We use the CLA measure, the Collegiate Learning Assessment, and if that measure was scored 0 to 100, 45% of students wouldn't have moved up even 1 point in the first 2 years. And overall, on average, only 0.18 standard deviation gains. The third set of findings, and perhaps the most important but also the most overlooked in the book, is the significant variation that we show. That we show that in every college and university there are some students applying themselves, working hard, taking rigorous assignments and moving up a tremendous amount on this CLA measure, more than a standard deviation, and others that are doing very little. There's variation across institutions, but even more within institutions. And again, trying to understand that variation can give you a point of leverage if you are interested in attempting to improve performance. And the measures we measured before, reading, writing, hour studying, all those are sensitive to greater and lesser gains on the CLA indicator. So moving along, that first book was on the first 2 years of students' experience in a 4-year undergraduate program. And the second book is the next 2 years, and then the 2 years after graduating as they attempt to make transitions to adulthood. And in the talk, I'm going to focus mainly on transitions in the labor market. But in the book, we spend equal time talking about transitions to adulthood more broadly in their personal relationships, in terms of civic engagement, and elsewhere. Happy in the question and answer period to talk about those findings. We're going to cover the following 4 areas in this presentation. 1, how do students experience college in terms of their academic and social orientations? 2, how are a recent cohort of students faring as they attempt to make transitions into the labor market, and how do they understand their trajectories? Are they happy? Are they disgruntled? Are they likely to be outraged at their institutions and eager to join Occupy Wall Street and march on Wall Street, or quite the opposite? And third, are demonstrated generic competencies, things that the CLA measure, do they track with labor market outcomes? Are they associated with improved labor market outcomes? If they are, that gives us added reason why we should care about them. Now, as academics, we might care about developing these skills regardless, but if in fact these skills track with early labor market success, perhaps they're even more important, and students, if they're aware of those relationships, might spend greater time and focus on developing them. And then finally, how can higher education more effectively prepare its graduates for successful transitions to adulthood? We'll be, in answering this question, this is based on empirical work, and the empirical work is all from a common study where we tracked a large number of students at 24 diverse 4-year institutions as they entered college, again, the sophomore year, senior year, and then the 2 years out. These students graduated in 2009 during a very difficult period in U.S. economic history, a period that will likely have lifelong consequences for that set of graduates, because early difficulties have been shown to have consequences throughout individuals' life courses. It's a study that by 2009, we had 1,600 students, down from 2,400 earlier. We had some attrition in our study, particularly of male students and of students at the bottom of the ability distribution. If we had the latter in our study, we'd have probably even more dismal findings than we do. So the bias is upward in exaggerating positive outcomes. In 2009, we asked students, do you mind if we follow you up after college? And if so, will you give us contact information? So from that sample of 1,600, we were able to track 1,000 into their postgraduate outcomes. And we were also, for the first time, able to have direct contact with them. Earlier, the institutions were mediating our relationship with them, after they graduated and agreed to participate further in the study, we could contact them directly. And so we have, for the first time, the individuals in their own words describing their college experiences and their post-college outcomes, how they make meaning of their situations. And that's a particular interest to us as sociologists, and perhaps particularly of interest to you as well. One last thing on the data piece before I move on is that I'll tell you a little bit more about this CLA measure, the Collegiate Learning Assessment. If you weren't here for the earlier talk or haven't read the work, the Collegiate Learning Assessment is what many argue to be the state-of-the-art measure of generic competencies in higher education. It gives students a performance task to complete that assesses their critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing ability. It gives them something actually to do. They're given a set of documents, and they're asked to think critically about them, with the information in the documents not all being equal, not all being reliable or valid. So they have to be able to look at information and make sense of it to understand whether or not it's valid and its importance or not. They have to synthesize information across these documents and then write in a logical argument that makes use of that evidence. Not a simple task, but again, one of the tasks that you'd hope college students could do a better job as they move forward. Now, in our work in trying to make sense of students' trajectories, this book shifts from our earlier arguments in that we really tried to understand. In our first book, we went in naively assuming that colleges were coming to students were coming to college with the expectation of learning. That learning was the central focus, mission, purpose of higher education. In fact, it's as an educator, that's how I always assumed this is what we were about. The evidence from that first book was so strong and overwhelming, clearly something else was going on here. Something other than academics had come to dominate the lives of colleges and universities. And so we tried to understand that and give it a clear explanation in the second book. And we argue that in colleges today, the social has come to replace the academic. The social has come to replace the academic in dominating the cultural, the institutional fabric. Good. I remember the old days with the clear overheads we put on. They were much more reliable. It wasn't so long ago. So again, the social replacing the academic. It's we believe it's aligned with this institutional commitment to a therapeutic ethic and personnel perspective. We rely on this historian Christopher Loss's work, who shows that following World War I, the personnel perspective developed in the Army. How do you make sure that individuals are well adjusted to their positions? Moves from the Army into higher education. And then in post-World War II era, increasingly has a therapeutic dimension to it that is aligned with people's self-fulfillment and self-realization. We also argue in this second book, borrowing from David Reisman's, that the institutions are increasingly focused on nurturing these other-directed personality types that are aligned not to inner direction, but rather to sensitivity to others and sociability with others, that we become finely sensitive to how others view us, and we orient our activities to how others view us. Think about Facebook and Twitter and all the social messages out there that distract us from what might be within in terms of our interpersonal drives to the drives of others. We also argue in the book that this was accelerated in the 60s and 70s from two things. One, federal dollars start to move to students as consumers so they can carry their loans from one institution to another. And so institutions have to compete to individual students in order to support themselves. And how do you compete for 17-year-old students? You invest in social amenities. You invest in dorms, fancy dorms, student centers, athletic facilities, and the social engagements. 17-year-olds, unless they're at the top of the academic distribution, choose colleges based on all this other stuff. And so again, it accelerates the movement in this direction away from academics towards the social. And also in the late 60s and early 70s, new laws were put on the books and case law was made in the Supreme Court that gave students increasing rights within these centers. Prior to that, the universities would act in loco parenti as if they were parents, regulating the social behavior of students, perhaps trying to shape their character formation as well. After that, it was clear students had rights, and it was very difficult to regulate social behavior in sensitive ways akin to a parent. So sometimes you have zero tolerance policies. If you show up with alcohol, you're out. But other than that, a lot of it moves off campus, and it's basically unregulated in unregulated spaces. And things like cheating and plagiarism double, right? So more than 50% of students will now tell you they have copied and plagiarized in college, double what it was 3 or 4 decades ago. So again, that accelerates this change. And then lastly, we see increasingly people are not just going to college, they're going away to college. They go into this residential model where they're living in dorms or they're around campuses, and they're staying there for longer and longer periods of time. So even 4-year undergraduate programs often take 5 or 6, and they're not commuting from home, but again, they're living in these largely unregulated spaces where there are aspiring adults with shared norms and values that emphasize the social, often not the academic. So now let's get to the data. Here's time use of seniors, senior time use. If you were here 2 years ago, it looks just like the sophomore pie chart. Students do not spend many hours in academic pursuits. These are full-time 4-year college students, and about 15 hours per week is in class and labs if they're actually showing up to class and labs, and 12 to 13 hours per week studying, a third of that studying in groups, 8 hours on average studying alone per week. Total that together, that's 28 hours. Not very much. In fact, it's half of what students studied 3 or 4 decades ago. It's dropped in half. It's less than what high school students study. This shows college students studying over time. Interestingly, high school students studying over time moves in the other direction. High school has become harder today than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So it's not something about the kids, it's something about the institutions, right? Because the trend lines are so divergent. I could also show you this in comparative perspective. This is the US compared to European countries in terms of total academic time in class and out-of-class homework. The U.S. is next to bottom in a European comparison. Only the Slovak Republic has less amount of time studying than the U.S. Now, interestingly, right? So the U.S. has the least amount of time studying compared to its European the European comparison group. But if we move to this next slide, living with parents. Remember, I told you the U.S. has a residential model. The students go away from home and live on campus or around campus. That's not the way higher education is structured everywhere. In fact, this is being a full-time college student, the likelihood you're living with your parents. And in the U.S., it's low and decreasing. And so if you go to regional colleges, regional public universities like Georgia Southern, Western Michigan, Central Michigan, they're all playing the same game. They're building residential dorms, student centers, athletic facilities. They're all competing over the same students in the same ways. And the trouble with that is, well, there's two problems. One, if people are moving away from home and living in campus and around campus, but the schools aren't allowed to regulate their behavior because of the legal environment, or it's very difficult to. They are immersed in these subcultures that, again, are not conducive to learning. So you would think that let me say this a little slightly different. At the individual level, if you are commuting to campus instead of living in campus, yeah, you're going to be studying less. It's harder. It takes a lot of hours to commute to your school, right? So it's better to live near campus or on campus, less commuting, more time to study. That's true at the individual level. But at the system level, you see the opposite. That the more that everyone is living on campus or near campus, the total level of studying goes down. And it goes down because these norms, these powerful norms that emerge from these aspiring adult communities, they're not conducive to academics. Why would they be? Why? It's the same thing if you looked at high schools or whatever. Their peers have their own norms and values, and again, it's not necessarily true that they're going to be aligned with adult academic expectations. Now, I said that there were two things that could potentially wrong with this model. One is this, that it might not be aligned with academic outcomes, student learning. The other is, of course, this. It's a very expensive model. The U.S. higher education system on a per-student basis costs twice what it does in Europe. So this model of residential college model and model of social amenities creates a lot of overhead, a lot of expenses that, again, have little academic function, but are essential if you're in the higher ed business to competing for the 17-year-old students. So if you're running a university and you try not to spend this money on the new student center and the new dorms and the other social amenities, you're going to be in trouble because the 17-year-olds, this is what they want. But as a system as a whole, it's a very expensive way to set this up. Now, I told you we had the advantage in this follow-up book of actually talking to the students and hearing in their own words what they thought. And so if you want to hear about their social engagement and their social activities, you're going to have to go to the book. And some of that is great, like Dan Chambliss mentions in his book. Some of it's not so great. Some of it is about the drugs and all the dysfunctional parts of that culture. And we don't emphasize that in our work, but we try to be true to what the students tell you. And they say, I lived with someone who was stealing, who was doing drugs, who was cutting their wrist. It was hard for me, from my background, to deal with that, but I learned how to navigate it. So it's not all great, the social engagement, but a lot of it is really positive. But and their social descriptions go on and on and on. But their academic, when we ask them about their academic engagement, this is what we get. These are different students. Student 1, I was a very good student. I did all my homework and I studied for all my tests. Second student, pretty committed. I went to 95% of my classes and I did all my homework. And for the most part, the readings. Notice the theme starting to develop here. Academic engagement means I do the minimum. Right? That's how the students themselves understand what it means to be a four-year student. Third student, actually, I put forth a good deal of effort. I was great about going to class. I think I really only missed a handful of classes. The entire time I was at college, I studied. Any homework I had to do, I did. Fourth, I was fairly academically engaged, and I tried very hard not to fail most of my classes. 5, I was a good student. I did my homework on time. I never missed deadlines. Now, again, we remember from earlier, 36% of them say I study alone less than 5 hours per week, and we give them a B+ average for that. So they think this is academic engagement. We've told them that. The experts in the room have told them this is satisfactory. This is more than satisfactory. This is good. But again, it's very limited in terms of kind of traditional understandings of academic rigor, and also if you look at it from a historical or comparative framework. Now, another way to think about this is you go and you ask students, how much do you think you learned? And I'm sorry that Dan Chambliss isn't here because a lot of his book is based on self-reported learning. One problem with that, it's not reliable. We're really, really poor judges of our own abilities and performances. And you can see this not just in education, but also in health and the workplace. There's a whole encyclopedia of psychological studies that show how bad we are at self-assessment. So when we ask students in our study, how much do you think you learned when you were in college? And in writing, 90% say we learned, a lot, moderate or high. But even the moderate in our measure is quite high. And so the vast majority think they learn a lot, and almost everything, a little bit in the math, it goes down a little bit, under Channing's charts and graphs. But even there, they're optimistic. Again, there's one problem. When you look for how this is correlated with actual objective measures of growth, it's weakly to not correlated. So they've come to have very high expectations or high positive understandings of their own learning in higher education. Again, we contributed to that. We're complicit. We told them they're B+. They got B+, A- for. How would they know better? We're the experts. They don't know what they don't know. And so you get this if you ask them. But again, if you measure on a standard, standard assessment like the CLA, and you get the same thing with multiple choice standardized assessments like the CAP that the Wabash study uses, you only get about a half standard deviation of growth from the entering to the end of 4 years. That is half of the growth that we saw 3 decades ago when similar tests were given to students in four-year institutions. There is some variation across institutions, across majors. I show you here box and whisker graphs, the less selective, selective, and more selective. A box and whisker is the dark in the middle is from the 25th to the 75th percentile. The tails at the top and the bottom show the range. And you'll see that, interestingly, you see a few things. There's a little bit more growth in the more selective colleges than elsewhere, but only a little. But there's a lot of variation in all these institutions. So again, we saw more variation within colleges than across colleges. So University of Rochester, Rochester Institute of Technology, it doesn't matter. You're going to have a lot of variation in students' ability within. Now, To pivot to the labor market findings and the transitions to adulthood, let me set it up with just one slide here. That we argue in the book that for middle-class students anyway, college is increasingly central in people's transitions to adulthood. And so it's a gross misreading of our work to say that we don't think college is valuable and important for transitions to adulthood. It would be foolhardy for any 18-year-old today not to attempt to go to college and finish it. The consequences of not going to college are great. Our argument is different. Our argument is that we do not get the full value for the time and money invested in four-year institutions. So we could do better by our students, not that you shouldn't go to college. College, again, it's increasingly central in people's lives. Now, we think of lives not just in terms of the labor market, but adulthood more broadly, and so we adopt in the book a conventional normative understanding of adulthood defined as you finish school, you leave home, you start work, full-time work, you enter into serious relationships, and you have children. You don't have to do all those things, but you should at least do some of them in terms of the traditional normative understanding about what it means to be an adult. We note that these milestones are coming later and later and later for people, not just in the US and elsewhere. And we argue in the book that college is a part of that. College is a part of that because, again, people are coming to college for longer and longer periods of time. Not just is it taking them longer to go through college, but also they go back to grad school. 30% of our students are back in grad school 2 years after graduating. Higher education, if you will, has come to legitimate emerging adulthood. It makes it normatively acceptable that you don't assume adulthood right away and you can have longer and longer periods of time of exploration and experimentation and the like, much of which is good, but again, if it's purposeful and not if it's just meandering. Now, where are the students in 2011, 2 years after graduating? Again, during a very difficult economic period. They're twice as likely not to be unemployed than if they hadn't gone to college. So again, it pays to go to college, but boy, are they struggling. A third of them are back in grad school. The ones that aren't, this is where they are in terms of their labor market outcomes. Less than half, 47%, have full-time jobs where they're making $30,000 or more. The others are in a range of other outcomes, 7% unemployed, another 4% really marginally employed, 12% in unskilled employment. Unskilled we defined in our work as you're in a job where the majority of people in that job haven't even gone to 1 year of college. So real dead-end work. If you add up those bottom, there's a significant number, about 20%, that are really dismal outcomes, partly due to the economy, for sure. But for us, we're going to be interested in what can you do not to be in that bottom quarter. Before we get there, let me point out some of their conditions more broadly. 21% have more than $30,000 in debt. About 12% have more than $50,000 in debt. A quarter of them, 2 years after graduating, a quarter of them are back living at home with their parents. Remember, these are residential people at four-year residential colleges. They've moved back. A quarter of them have moved back. 30% were back at home 1 year out. 25% are still back at home 2 years out. 75% report they're receiving financial assistance from their parents 2 years after graduating. And again, let me be clear, this is normatively acceptable, all these things today. That too has changed. We've moved from a period where it might be expected that college graduates help out their parents, help out their family. That's long gone. Now, does that CLA matter, those generic skills? Well, yes, it does. This is the unemployment, unskilled employment, and job loss. The two columns, one is the high CLA, a standard deviation above average, low CLA, a standard deviation below average on the CLA. And you'll see on all those outcomes, it matters whether or not how you leave college in terms of your generic skills. It's not something just a bunch of fussy professors, critical thinking chairs and the like, Provost, that care about. It turns out we care about these things and they actually matter in the labor market. Not the only thing that matters, but they do matter. And the easiest way to see it is on the job loss figure. This is people who had jobs in the year before and they lost their job. A real indication that something was wrong with their college education. They had a job and, you know, the employers perhaps saw something that this is not what we thought we were getting with a college graduate, and they lost their job. Twice as likely to be in the job loss category than not if you had low CLA scores. Other things matter here, the college selectivity, the field of study. Now, I'll just point out one finding here of significance, the business school, because of the business students. Because I have to be fair to them. 2 years ago, I came here and I said, from Academically Adrift, boy, look what's going on in these business schools. They're reading a number of courses with reading more than 40 pages per week, rock bottom. Number of courses with writing assignments more than 20 pages per semester, rock bottom. Hour studying, rock bottom. Boy, these business programs. What's happened here? The business programs, Eugene Fram, who this program is named after, will like this. If I recall, he is taught in the business schools. Those students are actually doing near the top of graduates 2 years out. Well, why? Why? Their CLA scores did not grow. They were at the rock bottom also in terms of growth. What happens? What explains this thing? Well, there are a few explanations we think that are plausible. One is that there might be something in colleges and universities other than these generic skills that matter. Subject-specific skills, accounting, marketing, finance, these things could matter, and business programs could be teaching these valuable skills. We also identify in our work something else that business schools do well that matters in terms of transitions. Students in those programs are more likely to have internships, apprenticeships, and use school job placement services. Each of those are things that contribute to smoother transitions following graduations. And so in this follow-up book, we argue that there's things we can learn from business programs in the rest of the colleges and university in terms of these programs, internships, apprenticeships, and school job placement services. There's no reason why you can't do some of those things better and more thoroughly in arts and science programs. And of course, we still do argue that because these generic skills matter, there are things that business faculty can learn from other parts of the university where they are taught more thoroughly. One other thing that's important to point out to educators and students alike is social networks. Students and their parents often say things like this: it's not what you know, it's who you know. Social networks matter in life, right? And so from that standpoint, hey, it might be perfectly rational not to spend time on academics, but to spend time building social networks, social engagements, building social skills. So we took that seriously and tried to see whether or not these social networks mattered for transitions after graduation. However, we found little to no, if not negative evidence of that. Very few students found jobs through family and friends, only about 10%. And when they did find those jobs through family and friends, they were worse jobs than if they had found them through other sources in terms of income and occupational characteristics. So the jury's out. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, maybe those social networks matter. But during the economic recession, 2 years out, don't count on your friends for help, because your friends might be, yeah, I can get you a job here at Starbucks, right? They're not in a position to help with these transitions, and those transitions matter. Now, I want to make one final set of slides contributing to a different piece that Chip alluded to in the introduction. What do students think about all this? And I said we had read a lot of media accounts about graduates with too much loan debt and couldn't find jobs in Occupy Wall Street. I teach at New York University and live a mile and a half from that site, and so maybe I gave those accounts too much credence. We could find none of that in our data. Graduates were incredibly sentimentally attached to the colleges and universities they attended. We asked them what could they change if they went back. Many of them said nothing at all. Sometimes I wish I'd been a little bit more involved in clubs, really marginal stuff. It's in the book. Really sentimentally attached. The longer they were away from college, the more their self-reported learning grew. Remember, I said I didn't trust that early on, but it turns out 1, 2 years out, it gets better, more inflated what they think they learned in college. So this is good for alumni fundraising, but again, different from what we expected. We also were worried, they had some dismal outcomes. It was 2011, during the depth of the recession. A quarter of them were living at home, 75% unemployed. Were they despairing? The opposite. They had unbridled optimism in the future. Here's 3 examples. The first, a grocery store clerk, a male graduate living with his parents. You think, yeah, below that. I feel generally confident in it, the direction of my life. I wish I had a little bit more direction, but, or the second one, unemployed female graduate living with her parents and deferring her loans. I'm feeling okay about the way my life is going. It would be cool if I had a job. I don't know. I tend to look on the bright side because I do what I can to change the things I dislike in my life, but I'm not going to hate on things that I can't change, because they're going to stay, so I might as well accept them, right? Remember the therapeutic ethic? Right? So she got that part. That could be on Oprah, right? And then this final one, you'll see, does a pivot about halfway through the explanation where she changed the meaning of what success is, and some of the graduates do that. But she says, I have good ideas. I know what I want to do. I know my path will be positive, but things are moving a lot slower pace than I expected. If nobody will give me a job, I'll just go start my own job to do what I want to do. A third of the graduates said they wanted to run their own business. It will be different, the respondent's life in comparison to the parents. It depends really on what you mean by better. I know I won't be as rich as my parents, but I know I'll be doing something that I like. Again, this sense of optimism, of increased optimism. And we see it in our quantitative data. We asked the typical question, do you think your life will be the same or better than your parents? And 90% say, yes, my life will be the same or better than my parents. And again, remember, many of them are living at home and getting help from their parents. Turns out it doesn't matter what their conditions are. What about if you're unemployed? What about if you're in these unskilled dead-end jobs? This year is just better. My life's going to be better than my parents. Doesn't matter. College graduates have this something that they carry around, this sense of optimism and entitlement about what the future will bring. And that's not all bad. Optimism is psychologically healthy. But, of course, we would, as educators, hope that they would have optimism grounded in concrete skills, competencies, attitudes, and dispositions, what it was required to get to where they wanted to get. So like I said, a third of them wanted to run their own business, but none of them were really taking steps, one or two of them only taking steps to be able to get there. And why I say this is different than college, it's about college, is the following. Often in the book, we try whenever possible to show historic data about college graduates versus non-college graduates from, as a backdrop from other nationally representative data sets. Here's something called the General Social Survey, and we go back to 2000, and the dark line on top is college graduates, the dotted line non-college graduates, on the question, do you think your life will be better than your parents? And what you see is this divergence going on in America where college graduates, even during the recession, increasingly are optimistic about their futures, non-college graduates despairing. And so, again, there's something happening that is where in college that we think contributes to this divergence. Again, not all of it's bad, but it would be better if it was accompanied with a grounding in training to help them meet those goals, high goals. And when we talk to the students, they would say, life will be better because I have a college degree. Or I think it'll be better because I have more education than my parents. And however, again, we found slightly over half the graduates saying they didn't have clear goals and a sense of direction in their life. That is, they were adrift. And again, it's not that we want everyone in lockstep knowing what they're doing. Experimentation, exploration is good if it's meaningful and purposeful. But again, if it's just meandering, we think it has consequences, particularly for students that aren't from privileged backgrounds, that don't have the luxury of finding themselves in their 20s. A summary, and then one more slide, and then I'll turn to Jim, our discussant. A quick summary of what we've covered. One, there's limited focus on academics and limited development of general collegiate skills in higher education. Of course, there's a lot of variation, and in every place we looked, we found students applying themselves and learning a lot. But again, that wasn't true for all students anywhere. Difficult transitions into the labor market and independent adulthood more broadly. Partly that reflects the economic circumstances, but we think partly it reflects other causes as well. We look in the book at things like civic engagement, which wouldn't be driven by the economy, and find really discouraging data on graduates' lack of civic engagement 2 years after graduating. We find, importantly, that these things that we cared about as educators, critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing, tracks with early labor market success. And then finally, we found that in spite of these difficult transitions, graduates were wildly optimistic about their futures. Overall, colleges do not develop students' general collegiate skills or prepare them for transitions to adulthood adequately or uniformly, but they do fortify graduates with a sense of optimism in the face of these difficulties. What is to be done? We argue that we need institutional leadership to emphasize learning and develop plans for improvement and support ongoing assessment and to improve program quality and student learning outcomes. We argue that faculty collectively need to take shared responsibility for this problem. An individual faculty member can't do it on their own. If you're the only one who's rigorous in your department, the students know it. They pick their classes after they consult social media sites and their peers to pick courses that are easier. So you have to do it collectively as a faculty, raising standards. One way to do that, interestingly, is what the faculty at the University of North Carolina did. They collectively got together. The faculty senate appealed to their administration and said, we want the transcripts to include for every course, the grade the student got and the average grade in the class. Quick administrative fix, the faculty themselves asked for this and demanded it, and very easy then to look at the transcript and see, has the student excelled by picking easy classes or by excelling and working hard in the classes that they took. Finally, we need to promote organizational cultures that emphasize students' academic engagement, not just social engagement and student retention. Not to say that those things aren't important. If Jan Chambliss was here, he'd give you all the good reasons why those things are valuable. I don't want them thrown out, but we've gotten the balance wrong. And we need to renew our commitment and focus on these core academic values of rigor and engagement. Finally, there's my email address and the email address of my co-author. You're free to email us, and there's a website with more information on the project. I look forward to the questions in the following session.
Did I mention I was given this task at 4:30 yesterday? Well, thanks very much to Chip for the opportunity to pinch hit for Dan Chambliss. I'm not an educational sociologist, really a historian by training, and what I want to do is simply reflect a little bit out loud about just the ways in which I'm kind of struggling to find the right framing narrative for all of Richard's important work. So 5 quick areas to suggest some conversation and further investigation. Let me just lay those 5 things out and then try to elaborate a little bit on them. So first off, how do we get real clarity on what is truly different about the present moment? And how do we properly contextualize that difference? Certainly my experience as a historian and work that I've been doing on the history of public higher education in the South makes me skeptical that in fact that what we're living through at the given moment is that much different than attitudes we faced and engaged even as early as the 1830s. How can we productively separate out, or at least assure a lesser negative correlation between actions that produce academic focus and processes associated with the social ethos, rather than seeming to devalue the process of individuation? And I think that's actually completely consistent with the recommendations that Richard was just making. In what ways is insistence upon rigor an adequate response to structural changes in knowledge production? I think just as a classroom teacher, I'm kind of overwhelmed with the ways in which my students engage knowledge and how different it is from how I went about learning. How do we allow for the possibility that we are amid a global transition in attitudes towards work? And in what ways do we honor and value student attitudes and perceptions about that transition? And finally, what is the relationship between a call for rigor and our commitment to democratic practice? What's the relationship between the learning agenda, as Richard's laid it out, and what we're increasingly being faced with, the so-called completion agenda? So let me try to elaborate a little bit more on each of these. So Richard Aram's 2 books constitute a terrific sociological Jeremiad, part of a long tradition of incisive social science that aimed to call us to a reordering of priorities and a rediscovery of first principles. From Veblen to C. Wright Mills to David Reisman and Christopher Lasch, and perhaps a kind of subjourney through Sinclair Lewis and Robert Hutchins. Professor Aram's critique of normal science in higher education is data-rich and equips us well to ask fundamental questions about mission and purpose of what we do. The most important part of any Jeremiad is its strong sense of covenant. Perhaps in our case, the continuity between disciplinary professionalism and commitment to the idea of an independent academy. And it's just hard to argue for Richard's call that we get our act together and take charge of our own house. This is a covenant that compels our participation in the conversation. And participate we do. There's something very resonant about how Richard describes our current moment with students. In offices, in hallways, in meetings, in conferences, we bemoan the managerial and therapeutic ethos that we believe diminishes our commitment to pure academic excellence. We complain of coddling and hand-holdings, of students unable to attend to multiple stage tasks or large-scale reading. And we even despise the insularity they seem to exude as a byproduct of subcultural affinities that we do not value or understand. And there's great pleasure in participating. And immediately then, I find myself, as a critical thinker, as Eugene Fram would like me to be, there's reason to be suspicious of that pleasure. In fact, my very first reflections as an undergraduate, my very first recollections as an undergraduate of faculty as a social group was that they seemed obsessed with how we students were constantly failing them. And sure enough, once you got to know them, they too had stories about how their predecessor professors complained incessantly about how they had failed them. So there's a cycle. We're involved in, at least partially involved in a ritual of initiation. In the reading of the Jeremiad, the hardest intellectual task is always the reading backwards, right? It's neither the diagnosis of the present moment, the present condition, or imagining a way forward. In higher education Jeremiads in particular, we always imagine ourselves to be the protagonist of the story, right? It's our own path. Those of us that found higher education most amenable and most valuable. Those of us who found it most affirming. Our own path becomes the relevant case at hand. In my work on the history of higher education in the South, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that even as access to higher education was democratized and extended in the late 19th century and early 20th century, a very significant portion of the student population engaged it as little more than a finishing school or as an extension of the country club. As late as the 1930s, I would say 30% of the population in the University of Alba came and went. Right? They didn't have any intention of moving towards graduation. And at least through the 1940s then, student participation was fluid and multidimensional and continues, I think, to some degree to mark student selection of a site to this date. And Richard's outlined some of this. They're as interested in us for where we are geographically, for the likelihood of them finding a romantic partner, for the site of the right fraternity or sorority, for its other amenities. So we are led then to engaging, say, 1950 to 1968 as a kind of golden age, the moment of our highest national investment in higher education, it should be added, and marked by the exigencies of the Cold and Hot Wars, the moment of Clark Kerr's multiversity. And if it is our golden age, we might cynically argue that the most effective intervention might be to reinstate the draft. Surely the federal government's most effective tool at producing academic focus among 18 to 25-year-old men. Clark Kerr insisted, of course, that the success of the multiversity in economic productivity would mean acceptable collateral damage in terms of student progress and survival. Kerr predicted that we would be hovering around 65% completion and was comfortable with that, felt that that was a perfectly acceptable way to move forward. Okay, so there's our first question. How do we get real clarity on what is truly different in the present moment, and how do we properly contextualize that difference? And again, I'm a skeptic about whether or not student participation, student attitudes towards schooling has changed that much over the past century. So a couple thoughts on Richard's formulation of the emergence and dominance of the therapeutic ethos. So Richard frames this privileging of the social as a kind of zeitgeist. Maybe more so, I think, in the book than he does here today in the presentation. But it may make more sense to engage it as a highly complex regulatory environment. FERPA, to be sure, but also the Civil Rights Act, the American with Disability Act, the decline of de facto and de jure and local parentis, the 26th Amendment of the Constitution, state laws about age of consent, court guidance from litigation in cases of student harm while in our care, and so on. And so we need to make clear, I think, as we engage this so-called therapeutic ethos, that we recognize that much of this regulatory environment that makes us engage students in a particular way is in response to critical failures in higher education in previous decades, right? Just segregation and sexism and the ways in which we did not open our doors to persons with disabilities. It might be worth arguing that in the context of the whole trajectory of higher education, our 40 years in this new space means that we are just relatively young and learning to balance learning with care and justice. The second point on the social, and this really has to do, I think, with the specificity of RIT and the distinctiveness of our experience here, and in particular, our unique partnership with NTID. Social adjustment in its fullest bloom, as we often see it here, as you engage students in, say, August, when deaf students or hard of hearing students are meeting each other for the first time. And for the first time, they are in part of a community. Well, that full bloom not only feels developmentally appropriate, but in fact seems expressly about the experience of joy and solidarity. For deaf and hard of hearing students, for minority faith communities, for gay, lesbian, bisexual students, for political minorities, the case must be at least entertained that the experience of communitas is not a substitute for critical learning, but for some it may indeed be necessarily be preliminary to that possibility. So it's a fair and necessary question to ask, as Richard puts it, whether or not social adjustment or even a sense of belonging or purpose is worth the price of admission, right? It is absolutely fair that we should engage whether or not the amounts of student debt that we see folks taking on is worth an excellent experience in social adjustment. Maybe there are other ways to organize it. We talk often about the effect of gap year, for instance, in other national cultures. So again, how can we productively separate out or at least assure a lesser negative correlation between actions that produce academic focus and processes associated with the therapeutic ethos rather than seeming to devalue the process of individuation? Third point is on the construction of what our sphere of influence might actually be and what opportunities we do have to intervene. And we talk often about the impact of parents and families, about larger economic transitions. But I just want to talk very quickly about the impact of technology on our experience of the classroom. My biggest challenge, I feel, as a classroom teacher is that my students carry a library around in their pocket, right? They have immediate access to knowledge that would take me days to gather 25, 30 years ago. And so what do I need to do as a classroom teacher to instill a sense of patience, right? To instill a sense of the necessity of going to original documents. Not an easy thing to do for a generation of young people who are used to absolute convenience. And rather than think that our students not read much at all, I think the challenge is actually that our students read incessantly. And they read so completely and so totally and so nonstop that our experience in the classroom in getting them to pay a particular kind of attention to a book, to a novel, is a challenging task indeed. So we remain fundamentally unsure, I think, of how to generate respect for patience as a virtue and as the backbone of critical thinking achievement. And we're incredibly early in this game. We're incredibly early in our Gutenberg moment, right? We're 15 years into this, at the most. 15 years in terms of trying to figure out what it means to manage students in a classroom, to get them to engage the ways in which we need them to. So in what ways is insistence upon rigor and adequate response to these changes, in what ways are measures of rigor that revolve around an amount of writing or an amount of reading appropriate to this shift in knowledge production? And let me just say as a pedagogical aside that my own experience as an undergraduate, I had many opportunities to turn in 30 pages of writing, but oftentimes it was back-end loaded, right? It was a single term paper at the end, and the outcome was all parts of the grade wrote on turning in that paper, and usually you got 2 lines of illegible remarks on it and no chance to revise. So somehow, I think it's absolutely important that we go back to the centrality of writing in the learning process, but we need to do it in ways that is consistent with what we know about good practice. Let me just finish up with questions about student intellectual agency. I didn't feel like those student quotes were representative of my own experience in conversation with students at all. And it may be that there's something different about what happens in a structured interview and what happens in an advising session or what happens through the friendships that you make with students. But I didn't feel like they were nuanced. I didn't feel like they were indicative of the ways in which students are wrestling with the current economic transition. We can project that ambivalence about work, ambivalence about the future is necessarily or obviously an intellectual weakness, but it also could be seen as transitional. It could be seen as the potential emergence of a worldview. It could be part of a large-scale transformation in our attitudes towards work. And perhaps hardest of all, it could be seen as an implicit critique of their parents' experience, an implicit critique of their parents' commitments. And I certainly saw this with the post-2008 generation. I think young people were shook up by the fact that they saw parents who had businesses for 40 years see them disappear. Folks who had worked for a single company for their whole life see those opportunities, see those commitments, that loyalty disappear. It's not surprising to me that students are in a complicated position at the moment as they try to work out what their relationship to a sense of vocation might be. So again, how do we allow for the possibility that we're amid a global transition in attitudes towards work, and in what ways do we honor and value student attitudes and perceptions about that transition? And then finally, let me just try to say very quickly, Richard was terrific enough to sort of anticipate the kinds of objections that Dan Chambliss would have made, or the kinds of interventions that he would have insisted upon. Dan definitely has a kind of methodological critique of Richard's work. First off, I would say that the time frame is too tight, that he's interested in a longitudinal frame, and that he really believes that conversation is the way to get the best data out of students. And as Richard laid out, certainly I would say more receptive to the kinds of peripheral benefits that students articulated as part of their college experience. The other difference, and again, I strongly encourage you to read Dan Chambliss's work in partnership with Richard's. It's really a remarkable and rich dialogue. When you make your core premise that we operate with a fundamentally open and democratic system, Dan would argue that it becomes remarkable that we get the cognitive return that we do. So if Richard's conclusion was that we're failing because we get 45% shift in cognitive improvement over 2 years, Dan's response is, we got 55% cognitive improvement over 2 years. And there's something, it's at least partially a kind of glass half empty, glass half full response, but I think there's something that we need to wrestle with there in terms of we do operate a system in which we provide an access point to all comers, right? And that certainly challenges us in terms of the kinds of changes we want to make. So what is the relationship between a call for rigor and commitment to democratic practice? How should universities balance the completion and access agenda with the achievement agenda? And I'm so happy to have had the chance to respond to Richard. Thank you.
Jim, thank you. It was fantastic. And you've channeled Dan Chambliss very, very well and said many things which I'm sure Dan would have never said, so we've really benefited. With Richard having an opportunity to respond to Jim.
Thank you, and those were, I really enjoyed those comments, both stimulating, articulate, went beyond, I don't think he channeled Dan. I think that was a very broader and useful response. So I had a few things, points of agreement and disagreement with his response that I'd like to share. First of all, he raises the typical historical question, how much of this is new? How much of it is just a story of historical continuity? Is this little more than a fall from grace story? And I would respond, first of all, there is historical continuity that for many students, always there were, academics was not the central sole purpose of going to college. College has always been about much more, but the institutions themselves have fundamentally changed over time. I don't see how that can be denied. First of all, in the US, they often had religious purposes at their core when they were started. And character formation was also a key element. When dorms were built for the first time, they were argued we need dorms so that we have access to control and shape character 24/7. And it's all a very different discourse today where dorms are about revenue centers. So something really has fundamentally changed in how the institutions see their purpose and function in terms of their relationship to the students. And also you see it with the hours studying and the rights of students. Things have changed fundamentally. But let's grant Jim's point that maybe nothing has changed in colleges and the relationship to students. I don't think that's true, but let's grant that point. The rest of the world has changed. We're in a globalized economic system now where if we were doing just what we were doing for decades, and that's what this looks like today, it's not sufficient because, again, the rest of the world isn't staying put. It's changing its higher education system and being more productive. So we used to lead the world in terms of college graduates. We now no longer do. Many countries have many more graduates than we do. They do it at half the cost. And in terms of their performance on comparative national exams, the OECD rates, the US is below average. And so again, even if this is the way it always was, and I don't think that's the case, there's something that's not going to work for what we need higher education to do in terms of the larger society. The second point, balancing social and academic, I have no disagreements there. I thought that was a sound point. The third point also, that academic rigor is an inadequate way to talk about the pedagogical challenges of the day. In fact, one of the central challenges is how do we deal with the new information flows? I agree with that. I concede that academic rigor is not an adequate pedagogical substitute for facing these complex challenges of our day. I love this phrase, 15 years after the Gutenberg moment. Exactly, these are the center for educator today. How can we not be focused on how to make use of this new information and technology in productive ways that serve our students? But again, that's separate from the problem that it's not that we've introduced all these new radical pedagogies that are effective, more effective than the past. We haven't yet discovered those, and academic rigor has disappeared. I think that is my fair way of seeing that. The fourth one about this wasn't fair to students' intellectual agency, that in fact, students today are grappling with working out their relationship to vocation in complex ways. I disagree. I mean, I don't think that's, certainly there are students that are doing that, and as an American Studies professor and even as a sociologist, we might encounter that in our everyday life of what the students bring to us. But by and large, the vast majority of higher education students are not trying to work out this relationship to vocation and the meaning of work and the relationship to the parents. They're struggling to try and defend their economic position and future in this country. And they feel that that with the growing inequality in our society, that they can no longer assume that these middle-class lives that their parents had often are going to be easily attained. And they're really struggling with that in ways that are not about these deep reflections about the meaning of work, I don't think, and their relationship to vocation, but really about how do I navigate this. And then finally, the question about democratic practice and moving beyond the completion agenda. Well, that's fine. It seems to me a very odd way to invoke Dan Chambliss's work, because his work is based on students at Hamilton College, a very expensive, selective liberal arts college.
That part was me.
Okay, so I'm very open to kind of how do we meet the needs of more students, but I don't find I found Dan Chambliss's work very useful and important, and I totally agree with you should all read it. There's useful, important insights in there, but I think it falls short in providing a helpful way forward for higher education as a whole, and the conclusions based on research that was generated from a small elite liberal arts college are not necessarily the most useful, valuable insights and findings to guide us as we meet these larger challenges that the system is facing.
I'll just pick up on the last one because maybe I didn't articulate the point well. It absolutely was me and not Chambliss. I think I was anticipating your set of kind of institutional recommendations and moving forward, which I find I'm in absolute agreement with. My interest is in anticipating the ways in which, as faculty, and I don't think this maps ideologically onto left or right at all, but let's say that from the north, we feel that we're under pressure to get students to the finish line, right, in any way imaginable. And where at the same time, we're being poked at, let's say from the south, by folks who say, well, slow down, what we need here is more attentiveness to quality. And I certainly don't believe that those are incompatible agendas, but I would say that as the ways in which faculty who have experienced the remarkable expansion of a number of accountability regimes over the past 20 years in our work, it's hard to get back to the original task of being attentive to rigor when you feel like you're being batted around, right? And so I do find it to be a compelling and confusing moment, right? That in some sense, both of these initiatives are oftentimes making their way out of the Department of Education right now. On the one hand, colleges are about to be evaluated on how many graduates, how fast, how affordable, and at the same time, we're being asked to focus our attention on the generation of very particular learning outcomes.
So a quick response, then we should open it up to not just go back and forth. So I would characterize the environment a little bit different than that. That is that 95% of the external pressure is on the completion agenda. How do you get more students in and through? And there's just barely lip service even paid to the attention to learning outcomes. And in fact, there's no measurement of that being asked in a systematic way. And it only bubbles up a little bit in the accreditation process, which, as you know, says, tell us how you're measuring learning outcomes. Great, thanks for telling us. And of course, any symbolic compliance is satisfactory there. And so to me, there's really no, there's no Southern Army here. This is all from the threats are all to the north, and we do need a little bit more of a balance. And I hope that the balance comes not from an external set of forces, an accountability mandate, but again from within ourselves, taking ownership of this problem. But let's open it up.
Yes, please.
It's been several decades since I've been in touch with the literature of higher education. But one of the things I remember when I was more deeply involved, the correlation between, especially in medicine and law, between academic rigor and academic success diminishes precipitously the further out the practitioner goes in his career. Is that still true?
So I'm not sure. The argument is that so I hear three things going on. One is academic rigor. Second is something about learning outcomes. And then the third is lifetime success.
Success in the career.
Lifetime success. So, so we never looked for the relationship between academic rigor and these transitions. We looked directly at the outcomes. If the question is, would I expect these generic skills to matter at subsequent life course moments less or more? I would say about the same, because the type of outcomes that were measured in our study are generic. They're not narrow subject. I would expect narrow subject-specific skills to matter less over time. These critical thinking, complex reasoning, ability to communicate in writing, those are things that should be able to transfer from job to job, industry to industry, occupation to occupation. And so I wouldn't expect diminishing effect sizes on that over time, but it's an empirical question.
Right. My second question is a demographic one. I'm wondering if we look at the expanding life expectancy of human beings, if the time spent in a pre-adult stage, young adult stage, and so on, is proportionately about the same, but longer in years.
Yeah. So in sociology, we have a population center in my department, and I hang out with a bunch of demographers. There's a theory in demography that you just take in the life course, and it's just been stretched out. So everything is happening, in the same sequence, but it takes longer in a later stage. I think that's the phenomenon that we were discussing in terms of aspiring adulthood and the difficult transitions to adulthood is completely consistent with that view.
One of your comments was that high school appears to have gotten more difficult and college has lost its rigor. Is there any implication in that we are sucking the lifeblood and energy out of our students before you guys get their hands on them?
So yeah, some people have looked at that phenomenon and said, okay, the U.S. is starting to look more like Japan. That also had this kind of culture of really rigor and competition at the high school level. And once you got into colleges, even the elite colleges, from what I've heard, it's very lax. So I think that's one possible account. I do worry that some of what's happened in high schools, if I wanted an explanation of what was happening in high school, I would say there's probably two forces at play. One is kind of this accountability, the No Child Left Behind, that high schools feel under pressure and are to have kids perform more better on tests and so on. Part of it, I think, is coming from middle-class anxiety about their kids' futures. And so these competition to get in the middle class, to get into elite higher education, where people are now applying to 15 colleges, and there's all sorts of kind of irrational, dysfunctional behavior happening at the system level. I think that's partly driving it too, people taking a bunch of AP classes, so on. So I'm not describing, and so this kind of gets back to your question about the academic rigor. I'm not arguing that, academic rigor is we just need to be harder on all the kids. I'm just trying as a sociologist to describe the phenomenon in ways that try to document what is different about the reality of how we're serving the students and how we're not serving students.
Yes.
I found remarkable that the sense of optimism of the students that he spoke to, especially given the period in which the survey was taken, 2009-2010 period, where we were undergoing the midst of one of the worst recessions. The question, it appears that the emphasis, greater emphasis, relatively greater emphasis, wonder if the reason for the sense of optimism, despite rather dire environment,
those few years ago. Is that because of the greater emphasis on the therapeutic ethos, which I think is very positive, the sense of optimism. Optimistic people make good leaders, I think. And America being, where it is in economic sense around the globe, that we need more optimistic people. So the question is, can we dial up the academic rigor and seek greater, more positive and learning outcomes without dampening that optimism?
Yeah. I think that's a fair response to the data. Again, I tried to be careful about saying optimism wasn't all bad, right? That there are these positive effects of it. And again, we shouldn't take that away from the students, but give them again a sense of the skills and competencies and attitudes and dispositions necessary for success. So I do think we do a disservice to students by giving them an impression that success comes so easily, that with an hour of studying a night, that's all it takes. I think that is not teaching them, it's not realistically grounding them in what it takes to be successful as an adult. And in everything I've attempted to do as an adult, and I'm still struggling in many of those domains, it's all very hard. You know, relationships, family, to do a good job, that is a lot of work. Your economic position, that's a lot of work. And so I do worry that we're not preparing people right in the attitudes and dispositions necessary for success. Was it Dewey who said, school should be not the preparation for future life, but should manifest life itself within it, what the reality is. And so, to paraphrase it a little bit, I don't know, Jim, you might have some response on the optimism pieces.
Well, I'm actually open to I guess, the more negative reading of it, which would be that there's something delusional about it in a sense. But I'm not completely convinced by how I understood the questions that were framed within the survey, which rarely seem to focus specifically on either earning power or wealth, but whether life would be better. And I still believe generationally that there is some substantive thinking that is taking place about their attitude towards leisure and their attitude towards work within the context of a cubicle, and whether or not they imagine for themselves a relationship with a company or an entity whose loyalty to them is thin at best. So as I read the questions, the response to will my life be better may in fact have to do that I have a more reasonable set of attitudes about my own expectations. I absolutely think that there is a real and palpable anxiety about preservation of the class status that they do have, that it's absolutely the case that it is a troubling contractual relationship that we enter in with students if they are going into debt, and we can at least guarantee them that they'll come out the other side at least in the same place that their parents were. But I'm certainly open to the reading of the data that they're really struggling and wrestling with trying to sort out what the way forward should actually look like.
And I should concede that although I didn't see that overall in the data, there were those few voices that tried to redefine the question, to say, yeah, I won't be better in terms of my economic outcomes than their parents, but I'm going to have a better life because I'm going to do what I want to do. So we did have a subset of responses that were like that and consistent with your story of.
My own experience is that there's an absolute and unconditional relationship between students' perceptions of their place here in higher education and employability, right? So the first question to students is, why are you here? Well, I'm here to get a job. If the second question is any job, I always end up having a very different kind of conversation with students. Well, no, I don't want just any job. I want a job that's consistent with my values. I want a job that's consistent with how I imagine managing my leisure time. I want a job that fulfills my sense of purpose. And so I do think that I think I'm with Dan insofar as I am more excited about more open-ended conversations.
Clark Hotgrass had his hand up.
So I have three sort of simple data-related questions. First, so one of your key measures is the CLA. Compared to international schools, how are the CLA gains in international schools at half the price? Sort of first part of the question. And do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, we don't know exactly. The CLA was used by the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, in this pilot feasibility study in about 12 or 14 countries that used measured economics, engineering, and these generic performances with the CLA. It was a pilot feasibility study, it wasn't longitudinal in character. They did freshman and senior, and the institutions didn't represent weren't chosen to represent a national sample. So we don't really know. We do know from other measures, so the OECD also has a PIAC, P-I-A-A-C, Program of International Adult Competency Assessment, something. I'm scrambling the end there a little bit, but those results, they are doing less than the college graduates, the U.S. compared to abroad in things like analytical ability, quantitative reasoning, less than average.
But is that an absolute or is that a gain based?
That's just an absolute, but graduates at the end.
So another CLA-related question. So we had a reference group, which was the college, you have the college students and their gains over college. Is there data on people who didn't go to college and sort of over that same time period what their gain was in CLA?
Yeah, or what their loss was, right? And so it could be that people not in college were diminishing their ability to do this over time, depending on what kind of jobs they had, or they could be increasing and it could be due to maturation. We don't have that data because our study, we didn't have resources to follow up people who dropped out of college and continue to measure them.
So one last data question. So in the job loss category, right, there was a correlation for selectivity and there was a correlation for CLA scores. Were the selectivity also correlated with CLA, right? So if you had a more selective school, you were already better off on those. In those analysis, did you take out the effect of CLA on selectivity and vice versa? Or were those combined?
Yeah, so those results are in the models we control for social background, and we have major selectivity and the individual CLA score in there simultaneously. So they are net. The estimates are net of controlling for the other factors.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, please, certainly.
First time I've been on campus in a long time. You're a wonderful presentation you made. Absolutely great data. But I think you're beating yourself up and you're looking at the wrong issue. All the backpacks have left. They got up and they were starting to walk out of this before you even got into the program. I find that appalling, quite candidly. That a lack of courtesy. Now, maybe they were going to go to a meal plan, and maybe they were coming for an assignment. I don't know. But as an outsider coming in, and it may not be politically correct, but I find it absolutely quite astounding to see that a person who is brought in at expense to provide information is rudely treated. And I think this is just terrible. The second thing is, I think that the statistics on them going home and being home and why they're optimistic is that maybe they aren't afraid. Maybe there isn't fear. Maybe there isn't the need to produce as there are in some other places where people are achieving more. But the sense of being hungry has a sense of being somewhat fearful. And I can tell you this, when I graduated, I was scared to death. I wasn't optimistic, but I knew that I had to do something because I couldn't go home and be a trust fund hopeful. And an awful lot of our issues we're dealing with are not the students' issues, it's the fact they can go home and live without concern with that. Yeah. And it's a real issue in society that prosperity is a challenge to deal with. It's not finding fault, it's what it is. But I think you're being a little hard on yourselves.
Okay. So I've got two responses. First, your first comment, it's worse than you think, because as a college professor, I wasn't offended by people walking out on me. It happens. It's become a normative expectation. And in fact, I teach an introduction to sociology class at NYU with 300 plus students, and on any given day, large numbers don't show up. There was a study done last year at Harvard where they put cameras, hidden cameras in the classroom to photograph the students to take attendance, not individually, but for the research purposes. And the average was something like less than 2/3 of students showed up for a typical lecture. So, yeah, this has become a normative expectation. And again, the problem is that we all take it for granted and assume this is just normative and okay. The second piece, I agree with you that there is a larger societal context where part of what we're seeing is a response to the affluence of the society, where people, that's immigrants always are the highest achieving students in a society. They come in and unless the barriers to entry are so low that there's no selection, if there are barriers to entry, the immigrants are always do better in terms of educational outcomes and labor market outcomes. So I do think part of it is that we're as a society we're very comfortable. We can afford to have colleges that are awash in social amenities. We can afford to have the luxury of incarcerating more people than any society in the history. I mean, the ability to have, 2-3 million Americans incarcerated, not working, not contributing to society. That's an affluent society, and so I do think that is part of the backdrop here.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the comment up there. Certainly, it is a problem of students leaving talks and so forth early. When we do poetry readings or other things at 4 o'clock, we often expect a large exodus around 10 of 5, and partly that's been going on for a long time. I remember 20 years ago at Michigan State, but also at you have to also understand that RIT students are, I mean, there's a very tight scheduling here, and many of them have late afternoon classes. Also, Thursday at 5 is a very popular time for club activities, and I guess the larger point about that is that how do we include extracurricular activities? I know a lot of students are involved with 6 or 7 different clubs. Many of them are involved with gaming as a professional matter, but also as a social activity. And, where does the certainly some learning, some cognitive learning and critical learning happens in various, quote, extracurricular activities. How do we differentiate?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of other valuable things that happen in colleges and universities, but I think where I would disagree with some of the other higher ed research, like Dan Chambliss, like George Koo, is that those folks argue that this other social engagement in clubs and activities somehow transfers magically to student learning outcomes. And we couldn't identify that association with our data. It just didn't exist. And once you move from the self-reported learning outcomes, we saw that relationship, but not the objective gains. And why would it? Why would participating in clubs and other social activities increases people's abilities to think critically, reason systematically in complex ways, to write? It could teach you all other sorts of other things, but it's not going to teach those general higher order skills that academics was always kind of a function and purpose of academic engagement.
Yes, we have time for one or two more questions.
Hi. I do greatly appreciate your talk this evening. I find that this is a topic that that most students, especially in the transition to high school, really should be thinking about, because it's ultimately us who are having these experiences and making these decisions. But one of the things, maybe this is just because I'm from Northern California, but I've noticed, and you know as well, that we have sort of a shift in how economically, or how high school students are thinking about the type of society they want to create for themselves. And mainly that is a society that is based around maybe being an entrepreneur, being a freelancer, being very artistic in the sense that they're able to use many of the online or web-based auction houses and that sort of thing to display their artwork. So there's sort of this shift away from this traditional corporate model of going into society that way. My feeling, and I wanted to, this is a question for you, is how do you think colleges are starting to, or do you think colleges are still in that traditional mindset of, we want to produce a student that will add benefit to our society, our corporate society, not necessarily to our, I guess, more creative, more personally reflective society?
That's great. I'm going to ask Jim also to respond, because this is right. This is right, consistent with your argument as well. So first of all, I'm glad for your earlier responses. When I teach Introduction to Sociology at NYU, my first day, I tell the students, okay, you think that what it means to be a student today is normal. It's taken for granted that this is the way it must be. It's not. This is how it's historically different. This is how it's different cross-nationally. And once you know that, then you can make the decisions on your own to be a full-time college student the way people around you are doing, or not. But to do it knowingly, to do it with the reflection of that it is being shaped, your understandings, your reality is shaped by the institution, by the historical moment, by the context. And again, that's the way I think empowering students the way you can. And yeah, I mean, what you're saying is very consistent with Jim's critique that in fact students are young people trying to imagine a new economy, a new society. It is true that if you ask young people who is your most admired person in your life. Bill Gates is mentioned by every group except African Americans. They have Obama first and Bill Gates second. That's what the data. So there is a moment we're living that technology, entrepreneurial success, and again, I told you a third of the students said, I want to run my own business. So that is part of the ethos today. Your question, are we preparing people well for that?
Yeah, I guess the last question is that once the students arrive in college, maybe they want to become entrepreneurs, become consultants, become freelancers, but the universities aren't teaching them necessarily the skills that they would need for that, or maybe they are, but they aren't doing it in a way that engages the students because I know, for example, I'm starting working on a startup, and I feel that here at RIT I do have that sort of support, but I know my collaborator is at a university where there is no support for that, and there's no way that he can learn without actually going off on his own and really having that initiative. So maybe if we're trying to apply our knowledge to more different types of individuals, I feel like that maybe that's a category, a very large category that most universities are sort of leaving out. I think that may have some of the reasons for this optimism, but more than that, for this sort of lowered performance in college.
Okay, so my read is that in higher ed in general, there have been establishment of a few small niche programs, entrepreneurialism, teaching entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurialism, but they're small programs only. And the higher ed in general is not done a very good job in terms of intentionally designing its curriculum to meet any of these challenges. And so the digital learning and the information, we're slow to respond there, we're slow to respond to this need. We in general, we lack the mechanisms or the political will to attempt to redesign curriculum to meet student needs in these ways. I don't know, Jim, what do you think?
Well, I would just add that our maker spaces on campus are thriving, and Simone Center and Magic Center are seeing absolute growth. And it is absolutely the case that I rarely run into a student at RIT who isn't trying to launch something. And so I do think that part of our challenge is to frame the kinds of questions that Richard has posed so powerfully about what core learning competencies are and how those core competencies serve the kinds of experiences that you want to have. And it's an interesting challenge because you're also right that much of the way in which we're structured as a campus and as a system is that for the longest time the model has been to produce graduates who would function well in an entry-level management position and make their way up through the organization. And we're really going to have to learn to juggle those priorities and to serve both masters for some time.
Last question, and then we do have to conclude.
Okay, I won't need a microphone. I see a big distinguishment. I'm a byproduct of Dr. Fram, so I'm dating myself. He's actually one of my professors here. Students, when I was here, came from families. The divorce rate now is 50%. When I came home from school, I did my work first. I didn't go out to play. I had two parents, I'm going to do this. They didn't go to college. They always told me I was going to go to college. I had no idea what college even was, but since that happened. But I see it as a distinguishable difference between 30-something years ago and now. I knew when I walked in the doors here at RIT, I had no safety net when I walked out. had 4 years to do it. Because Mommy and Daddy, first of all, they weren't writing me any checks. I was working to get myself through it. So I think that's a big difference where these kids are coming from today also. K through 12, I think they've ripped critical thought out of the curriculum altogether. And this is not the time and place to start learning. And I mean, I don't know if you've seen that in your study.
Yeah.
I prefer leadership that's authentic. I came here with nothing. The largest company now I've been CEO is $7 billion. Here's my phone. Don't need it. I'd rather talk to you. I'd rather exchange ideas. We can disagree, not agree. That's how the world really works.
I think your point is really superbly made, and I wish we had more time.
In
But
high school, we were taught that that's how to learn. Then we came here to learn.
So
I think we need to conclude, and I thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to conclude.
The tail end of industry for their manufacturing jobs to what? We have a service economy. Everything is shifting.
So I would agree with you that I would say it a little differently, that the challenges that we are facing in higher education and society as a whole are very much have increased for many of the reasons you mentioned. The family situations so it's not only that there's a high divorce rate, but also remember that there's a rise, which is a good thing, in women working. And so there's less parental presence at home, even when you have two parents. The rate of two parents that are each working more than 50 hours a week has gone up dramatically. And so there's less social capital, less social supervision at home that makes it more difficult to bring up young people, socialize in the attitudes and dispositions aligned with adult success. We need our schools to do more. I fear that a lot of the things we've constrained both K-12 and higher education. So at the moment when we need them to do more, they're actually less effective than they were in the past.
Thank you. I wish we could continue. Thank you so much. And thank you. Wonderful questions.
If we could take our seats, we're going to begin our program. And I am pleased to welcome our trustees, our distinguished guests, our colleagues, faculty, staff, students, and friends. This afternoon, we inaugurate a new annual tradition. It can't be an annual tradition unless you've done it twice, right? But anyway, this is the first. Namely, a spring Eugene H. Fram lecture to complement our fall lecture by the same name. Now, many of you attended that lecture last September. In fact, a number of you have been present at all of them. You would thereby know that today's special guest is Professor Richard Arum of New York University, and he's no stranger to this stage. We are fortunate that he has agreed to return to RIT, especially given his demanding travel schedule and other commitments. And you will see he's been a busy man since the last time he was here. Today, he will present the findings from his latest book, Aspiring Adults Adrift. That's like me. An important follow-up to his landmark study from 2011, Academically Adrift, which sent shockwaves throughout much of the educational establishment. It sparked a healthy and important debate about the core mission of higher education, with its call for a renewed emphasis on writing, complex reasoning, and critical thinking, such essential lifelong skills. And I might add, the related dispositional attitudes that go with them is precisely the reason why RIT established the Eugene H. Fram Chair in Applied Critical Thinking, with the support from an anonymous RIT alumnus in honor of his former teacher, mentor, and friend, Gene Fram. And Gene himself is the J. Warren McClure Professor Emeritus of Marketing at the Saunders College of Business. By the way, that was all strung into one sentence, but I changed it. Gene served on our faculty for an amazing 51 years. And we are so grateful to him for his example. Gene has traveled all the way from sunny Northern California to sunny Rochester to be with us today. So, Gene, please stand and be recognized. Where are you? Here. Now, critical thinking remains a key competency that all employers demand from our graduates, in fact, increasingly so. Critical thinking is also necessary and vital for a truly democratic society to exist and to flourish, in my opinion. In fact, I think we are at an age where the value of a college education as training for productive citizenship is under attack, and we need to defend that at all costs. Ultimately, we desire for our students to become actively engaged global citizens. In a deeper and more profound sense, critical thinking can help them to understand themselves, the world, and their place within it. RIT aims to take the lead in this area, to become a model for other institutions, and to work tirelessly to make this a priority here.
It argues that many of our colleges and universities share equal responsibility for this problem. Far too many have adopted a therapeutic ethic, a concierge, country club mentality, regarding their students, as well as their parents, as consumers, to be satisfied at all cost. Social engagement and sociality, the demand for amenities, and other expensive services has taken priority in many instances over our core academic mission, namely, to promote robust student learning and academic rigor. If the students contemplated Plato while floating down the campus's lazy river, then Aram and Roxa's argument would not be as sobering. Sadly, this is not always the case. Their findings show that recent graduates possess a false sense of optimism and hope, a sense of entitlement, as well as a belief in their own exceptionalism that borders, I think, in times on the delusional. Professor Aram is not, however, a cynic or a pessimist. There is a strong pragmatic, and I might even add, idealist subtext to his argument. He cares deeply about education. He cares deeply about our students, about our faculty, and I think about our administration as well. And even broader, our society. And he wants nothing more than for all of them to be better served. He acknowledges that reversing the course will take hard work, time, courage, and determination. Now, unfortunately, Daniel F. Chambliss, the Eugene M. Tobin Distinguished Professor at Hamilton College, who had accepted very warmly and graciously my invitation to serve as today's respondent, is unable to be here today. I think it's a real mark of what kind of man Richard Aram is, that when I informed him of this, he said, I am glad to give Dan co-billing, co-time, co-stage. I admire him and respect him so immensely. The reason Dan Chambliss is unable to be here is he suffered a mild heart attack late Tuesday afternoon, and he's recovering at the hospital. His prognosis is very good, and he really does deeply regret his absence. I'd encourage you to read his book, How College Works. It's very, very interesting and very worthwhile. I'm immensely grateful to Dr. James Hall, the new director of the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies, who's agreed to step in, to pitch hit as our respondent today. It was Jim who first recommended Chambliss's book to me, and maybe he will regret that now, this past fall. And I'm very, very grateful to Jim for this reading tip and certainly many other excellent reading tips. In his brief 6 months that he's been here at RIT, Jim has already made a profound impact on our campus. I very much look forward to working with him in the months to come, and I'm very grateful to him for
the lack of academic rigor. Our pedagogy might be good and improving, but it would really have to be exceptional to overcome this lack of academic rigor. And in fact, what you see is large numbers of students moving up very little on on a measure we give of their generic performance, their generic competencies in higher education. I'll tell you a little bit more about this measure shortly. We use the CLA measure, the Collegiate Learning Assessment, and if that measure was scored 0 to 100, 45% of students wouldn't have moved up even 1 point in the first 2 years. And overall, on average, only 0.18 standard deviation gains. The third set of findings, and perhaps the most important but also the most overlooked in the book, is the significant variation that we show. That we show that in every college and university there are some students applying themselves, working hard, taking rigorous assignments, and moving up a tremendous amount on this CLA measure, more than a standard deviation, and others that are doing very little. There's variation across institutions, but even more within institutions. And again, trying to understand that variation can give you a point of leverage if you are interested in attempting to improve performance. And the measures we measured before, reading, writing, hour studying, all those are sensitive to greater and lesser gains on the CLA indicator. So moving along, that first book was on the first 2 years of students' experience in a 4-year undergraduate program. And this second book is the next 2 years, and then the 2 years after graduating as they attempt to make transitions to adulthood. And in the talk, I'm going to focus mainly on transitions in the labor market. But in the book, we spend equal time talking about transitions to adulthood more broadly in their personal relationships, in terms of civic engagement, and elsewhere. Happy in the question and answer period to talk about those findings. We're going to cover the following 4 areas in this presentation. 1, how do students experience college in terms of their academic and social orientations? 2, how are a recent cohort of students faring as they attempt to make transitions into the labor market, and how do they understand their trajectories? Are they happy? Are they disgruntled? Are they likely to be outraged at their institutions and eager to join Occupy Wall Street and march on Wall Street, or quite the opposite? And third, are demonstrated generic competencies, things that the CLA measure, do they track with labor market outcomes?
I'm pleased to note that critical thinking is a central theme of our new strategic plan, as you know, titled Greatness Through Difference, and that it is a key learning outcome in our revised general education framework. Today also marks the end of the initial 3-year term held by Professor Clarence B. Sheffield, Jr., the inaugural recipient of the Fram Chair, who is stepping down and who will return to the classroom. I don't think he ever actually left the classroom, to tell you the truth. He will hand over the reins to a very capable successor who we will anticipate naming very soon. I guess if I told you, I'd have to kill you or something like that. Chip has worked very hard to establish the necessary foundation, to set up the proper course, and to make critical thinking a significant part of our campus culture. He also acknowledges that there is much work left to be done. Please join me in thanking Chip for his efforts, as well as welcoming him to the podium to introduce Professor O.
Thanks very much, President Dessler. It's a beautiful day. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. It's just really fantastic to see so many faces, friendly faces, and so many friends. Over the last decade, Richard Arum has achieved special prominence in the vast and exceedingly complex landscape called American higher education. He is a professor, as President Dessler noted, in the Department of Sociology, with a joint appointment at the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU. This fall, he will begin a 3-year term as the NYU Sociology Department Chair. Richard is widely recognized as one of our nation's foremost sociologists of education. If our colleges and universities are indeed in a state of crisis, increasingly under threat from a variety of forces, then there is no one better suited to explain the myriad factors that have led to this situation, its broader social implications, as well as a possible road map forward. That is a workable solution to the problem than Richard Arum. He truly has his finger on the pulse of education, not simply in the United States, but in a global perspective. This is one of the reasons why he was asked to serve as a senior fellow at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. Richard earned his BA in political science from Tufts University, magna cum laude, his MEd in teaching and curriculum from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, and his PhD in sociology at University of California, Berkeley. Academically adrift, which has been referred to, his landmark 2011 study, co-authored with his former student, Josipa Roksa, argued that the students, and to a certain limited extent, the faculty, were to blame for the decline in academic rigor. His latest book, their latest book, Aspiring Adults Adrift, makes a significant pivot or a shift, agreeing to be our respondent on such short notice. Richard, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back.
Thank you very much, Chip. Very gracious as always. And thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day. Anxious and excited to be sharing with you this follow-up, this sequel, if you will, to the work I shared with you here 2 years ago. So let me start with a one-page review. This is some of your best or worst professors do in class. This is a review of the my last time here, the Cliff Notes version of Academically Adrift. And it turns out the Cliff Notes version is very useful because one of the findings I'll share with you on the lack of academic rigor is that a third of students say that they don't have a single class where they read more than 40 pages on an average week. And so Academically Adrift has 150 pages. It would take a month. And so now you have the Cliff Notes version. We'll share these PowerPoints maybe after, and you can just give them the one-page version. And the one-page version goes something like this. There's 3 kind of core arguments there, core sets of findings. The first on limited academic rigor. And that is if you actually go and ask students in a typical 4-year institution, not all of them, but many of them, too many, will say they're exposed to very limited academic rigor. And some of the findings I shared with you, the average, the number of students that'll say they don't have a single class with more than 40 pages of reading per week, but also half the students will tell you they don't have a single class with more than 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester. Not a single class. That's not a 20-page paper, mind you, but all their writing put together, not a single class, half of the students. And if you ask them about hours studying, a little more than a third will say, we study alone less than 5 hours per week, less than an hour a day, and their grade point average is a 3.22. We had their transcripts. You don't need to study more than an hour a day in order to do well, particularly if you're in that group that's taking courses with little writing and little reading. That's the first piece of set of findings. The second would be limited learning. And of course, there's limited learning once you start off with the